Chapter 5 The Mysterious Round River. When Paul Bunyan had cut down all of the trees in the Red River country, he called his men together. "Tomorrow we go into the North Woods where no white man has ever gone before. It is to the west and the north near the Great Lakes, and it is the largest forest in the world. The Indians say that the trees grow so large it takes all afternoon to walk around one." Tiny Tim, the water boy, was so excited he clapped his hands. "Do the trees grow taller than the pines on Onion River?" he asked Paul. Paul Bunyan smiled. "The trees there grow so tall that you can only see the tops of them on very clear days," he said, "and they grow so close together they hide the sun." Everyone wanted to see this wonderful forest, so Paul hitched Babe, the blue ox, to the bunkhouse and the kitchen and all the rest of the camp houses and started on the long trip to the North Woods. They followed an Indian trail through the forest for 30 days and 30 nights. Then they came to the large, deep river in the middle of the woods. "Everybody stop. Here is our new camp," said Paul. The force of Paul's voice knocked Ole, the big Swede, over and broke 18 windows in the dining room. I lost my place. There we go. Babe, the blue ox, was thirsty and went to the river and drank and drank. The river became smaller and smaller, and all the fish were left high and dry on the banks. The cookhouse boys caught them with their bare hands. That evening, Hot Biscuit Slim cooked a fine fish dinner. The next day, the river filled with water again, and the men started cutting down the trees and sawing them into logs. In a few days, the first raft was ready. Ole, the big Swede, jumped on the raft. 20 men followed him. They cut the ropes that held the raft to the shore. "Hurrah, they're off!" cried the men on the bank as the logs started down the river. The river wound in and out through the dark forest. Ole and his men saw bears and once in a while a deer that had come down the river to drink. Soon they came to an open space in the forest. "Look ahead, men," said Ole. "We are almost out of the woods." Here all the trees had been cut down. For miles along the riverbank they saw nothing but tree stumps. Suddenly one man cried, "Look! There's a camp exactly like the camp of Paul Bunyan." The river quickly carried the raft of logs past the camp and down into some more woods. A little later, they came to another open space and another camp exactly like the camp of Paul Bunyan. "This is strange," thought Ole, the big Swede, "for Paul told me we were the only woodsmen in the North Woods." The men were getting frightened. Everyone kept looking ahead as the river carried them along through the dark forest. Little Blackie, the axeman, pointed ahead. Sure enough, there was another camp, and it too looked like the camp of Paul Bunyan. There was a kitchen and a dining room and a bunkhouse and even a blacksmith shop painted red, like the shop in the camp of Paul Bunyan. As they went past the camp, Blackie pointed to a clothesline on the shore. "There's a blue shirt exactly like the one I hung on the line back at Paul's camp." Just before dark, they came to another open space in the forest and another camp exactly like the camp of Paul Bunyan. Look at the men on the riverbank waving at us," said Ole, "and see the huge giant walking out in the water." The men on the raft were about to jump into the water and swim for their lives when little Blackie cried out, "Why, that's Paul Bunyan himself." And sure enough, it was Paul. And there on the bank, they saw Hot Biscuit Slim and Tiny Tim and all their friends. Paul took them to shore, and they found out that they had been on the mysterious round river that flowed around and around in a circle. They had been going by their own camp all the time. Chapter 6, The Winter of Blue Snow. One night in the North Woods, I can't quite see that with my video. The men were seated around the campfire. Let me start that over. One night in the North Woods, the men were seated around the campfire. They were telling of their adventures in the other camps. Someone asked Paul to tell them of the earlier adventures. Tell us about the winter of the blue snow, cried Tiny Tim. Well, said Paul, I was logging with my father back in the Maine woods. That was the winter when I found Babe the blue ox. Only he was a little calf then, not much larger than Tiny Tim. Not much larger. Old timers sometimes speak of it as the year of the two winters. When summer came, it got cold again, and in the fall, it turned colder. For 2 solid years, the snow covered the ground so deep that only the tops of the tallest trees showed through the snow. The snow was blue in color and over 200 feet deep in places. The Great Lakes froze solid to the very bottom and would never have thawed out if loggers hadn't cut the ice up into small blocks and set them out into the sun to melt. When spring finally came, they had to get a complete new set of fish for the lakes. The camp was buried under snow, and the men rode up to the surface in the elevators. Each man had 16 blankets so that he would be warm at night. Shock Gunderson, who was the head sawyer, can tell you how cold it was. He slept under 42 blankets, and one morning he got lost and couldn't find his way out. It was 3 days before we could find him, and by that time he had almost starved to death. It was so cold that when Hot Biscuit Slim set the coffee out to cool, it froze so fast the ice was hot. The men had to eat breakfast with their mittens on, and sometimes the hot biscuits were frozen solid before they could take a bite. The bunkhouses where we slept were so cold that the words froze as soon as the men spoke. The frozen words were thrown in a pile behind the stove, and the men would have to wait until the words thawed out before they knew what was being said. When the men sang, the music froze, and the following spring, the woods were full of music as odd bits of songs gradually thawed out. Very few trees were cut that winter, as we had to make holes in the snow and lower the men down to the trees. Then we would pull the trees out of the holes with long ropes. The men all let their beards grow long as protection against the cold. Some of the beards were so long that they got in the way, and the men were always stumbling over them. We made a new rule in the camp. Anyone with a beard over 6 feet long had to keep the end of it tucked in his boots. In the spring, the beards were so thick the men had to shave them off with their axes. When Christmas came, that year the men were homesick for some good old-fashioned white snow. Doesn't seem like Christmas, they cried, with all this bright blue snow on the ground. So I decided to put on snowshoes and travel west until I could find some white snow. Well, sir, I climbed over mountains and across plains right out to the Pacific Ocean, which was frozen solid. The ice seemed fairly thick, so I kept on going. And do you know, I had to travel clear to China before I could find any white snow. But the men were certainly happy when I brought them back some white snow for Christmas. We had a lot of trouble with frostbiters that winter. They were little animals about 3 inches long that lived in the snow. They bit the men on the feet as they walked along. Even now, you hear of people being frostbitten, but that winter, it was much more dangerous. The blue snow finally melted in the spring and filled many lakes in the woods. To this day, many of the beautiful lakes in the mountains are still colored blue from the winter of the blue snow. The Indians call the country the land of the sky blue water.